Good evening, and welcome to today's panel conversation on racial disparities in the criminal justice system, incarceration, and the law. My name is Michael Deli Carpini. I'm a faculty member and former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. For those of you who are new to this series, this panel is the sixth of the 13 we are holding over the course of this academic year as part of the preceptorial, which is essentially a non-credit bearing course on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. The preceptorial is designed for Penn undergrads, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. I'm pleased to say that at last count yesterday, we have over 150 people registered for today's event. The preceptorial is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program at Penn and co-sponsored by a number of other important Penn centers and offices, including the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives, all as part of the Year of Civic Engagement at Penn. While inspired by such events as the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protest, demonstrations, and the calls for change that emerged from them, this series of panel discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism, and to identify what we might or what we have or might do to address these inequities. Today's panel is the first of two focusing on the criminal justice system. I should note to the audience that you can use the Q&A function on your screens to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we'll leave time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. Now, we have another stellar panel to address today's issues and your questions, who I will now very briefly introduce. So I'd ask the panelists to unmute their videos now so that the audience can see who you are as I introduce you. Great, thank you. So first is Regina Austin, the William A. Schnader Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Austin's scholarship focuses on the impact of law on cultural conflicts arising from race, gender, and class inequality, with much of it revolving around the critical analysis of ethnographies and law genre documentary films and photography. She directs the path-breaking Penn program on documentaries and the law, which hosts screenings of law genre documentaries, maintains a national archive of clemency videos as resources for capital defense attorneys, and produces mitigation videos on behalf of young first-time defendants in cooperation with the Defender Association of Philadelphia. Treating digital video technology as a tool for legal argument and persuasion, Professor Austin teaches a visual legacy advocacy seminar that allows law students to make social justice advocacy videos that support the work of public interest organizations, social service providers, and grassroots groups, their clients, and their causes. Professor Austin was the producer and director of Second Looks, Second Chances for Pennsylvania Lifers, Commutation by the Numbers. She's author of numerous articles and book chapters, including the forthcoming paper, Not Just a Common Criminal, The Case for Sentencing Mitigation Videos. Our second panelist is Dorothy Roberts, the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond, Pace, and Sadie Tanner Mossell Alexander Professor of Civil Rights at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Roberts holds appointments in the law school and the Departments of Africana Studies and Sociology. An internationally recognized scholar, public intellectual, and social justice advocate, she has written and lectured extensively on the interplay of gender, race, and class in legal issues, and has been a leader in transforming public thinking and policy on reproductive health, child welfare, and bioethics. Professor Roberts is the author of a number of award-winning books, including Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. She's also received a number of prestigious awards from the National Science Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Dorothy Ann and Clarence L. Viersteig Distinguished Research Fellowship. And last but certainly not least is Hannah L. Walker, Assistant Professor of Government at the University of Texas, Austin. Professor Walker's research examines the impact of the criminal justice system on American democracy, with special attention to minority and immigrant communities. Previously, she served as Assistant Professor of Political Science and Criminal Justice at Rutgers University, and as a postdoctoral fellow with the Prisons and Justice Initiative at Georgetown University. Professor Walker is author of numerous publications, including her book, Mobilized by Injustice, which explores the conditions under which, despite other negative outcomes, criminal justice experiences such as the police brutality witnessed in Ferguson can catalyze political action. I want to thank you all for being here tonight and giving up your time for doing so. So while today's panel is focused on the criminal justice system, and future panels in this series will focus explicitly on the political system, I would like to give the panelists a chance to reflect on any recent events in particular, but not necessarily limited to the recent elections, the problematic transition in government, the current impeachment hearings that are going on even as we speak, all of which, or anything else, all of which have major implications for issue of race in the criminal justice system in the US. So let me start with Regina. Regina, what are your thoughts on any of these or other recent events and aftermath, the role race played in them, and so on? Anything you'd like to mention at this point? Oh, you're muted, Regina.
I think that I would be remiss if I did not make a reference to the people who are sick and dying in our penal institutions. We don't know exactly how many people have been sickened by COVID-19, how many people have died. That includes residents and staff, because the institutions don't have a real benefit to being precise with regard to the numbers. But I thought that I would read to you a letter that was written by one resident at SCI Phoenix, which is the state correctional institution near Philadelphia, a place where I work with lifers, about another resident who passed away January 31st, 2021. He describes this person as my dear friend. I have known Bruce since 1989 when we worked together in the industry's office and continued to work together when I clerked in the activities department. He was truly a good friend and possessed all the good qualities one would seek in a friend. He was kind, honest, and gentle, always willing to help those in need. He tutored Villanova University students in Latin, sold Girl Scout cookies for many years, and was heavily involved with the Lifers prison-based organization. He was committed to the indoor-outdoor volleyball program and rose to league commissioner. He was always honest, fair, and diffused heated volleyball games with his wise words and calm demeanor, a true gentleman. We talked regularly about his plans to move in with his sister in Northeast Philadelphia. His son had a car, phone, and a bicycle for him. Bruce dreamed of a Sunday bicycle ride along the Schuylkill River on Boathouse Row. He was so excited to go on a ride with his children. His smile filled his face in those moments. We planned our ride together someday. I look forward to speaking to him every day, which was easy as we lived on the same tier. I feel so bad for his loving family that always fought hard to get him home. He was only the governor's signature away from freedom. Society missed out on Bruce's reentry. He would have shined brightly and given as much love as he received. Be free, my friend. You are dearly missed. Bruce was 69 years old. He had served 45 years in prison. He was one of 13 persons waiting for the governor to sign off on their commutation when he died.
Thank you for that, Regina. As far as I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there is no plan for when the prison communities will be included in the vaccination plans. Am I right about that?
I think that's correct.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
And there's a lot of controversy about giving people who are housed in congregate facilities of penal nature the vaccine or a priority with regard to the vaccine.
Yes, I know that that is true. I don't see what the controversy is, but I know that that's true. Dorothy, anything you'd like to talk about in terms of recent events?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up on Regina's theme of the pandemic and the way in which it's caused unequal suffering and death in the United States, and the way it reveals longstanding unequal structures. It shows very painfully and vividly who is at risk of dying and who and why. Some of my work is in medicine and the way in which racist ideologies about biological difference continue to circulate in medicine. And some people believe that Black people are dying at higher rates because of some innate problem that Black people have. And I think the pandemic shows how these deep inequalities in living conditions that stem from structural racism are what's really the cause. One is the way in which it's killing people in prisons and the devaluation of incarcerated people's lives that this reflects. Another is what's happening in foster care, where reunification efforts have been stalled in many places. Parents aren't able to visit their children. Children in juvenile detention centers haven't been able to visit with loved ones. And all of this is a result of institutions that were already structured to kill and cause suffering to Black people to begin with. Now, on the other hand, I also want to mention that it's a strange time because we're seeing all of this inequality brought to stark relief that's causing huge damage to people's lives. And at the same time, we're coming off of the uprisings of last summer, which have produced efforts, at least we don't know how they're going to pan out, but the beginnings of more widespread, I think, efforts to attend to structural racism. And I think we need to see whether they're going to continue and whether they're real and whether they're going to produce real change.
Yes, thank you for that. And I just read something in the Inquirer, I think it was this morning, that of the vaccinations that have taken place in Philadelphia, although 40% of the Philadelphia population is African American or Black, only 17% of the vaccinations so far have been given to that to African Americans, and there are complicated reasons for that. Yeah. But at heart are the issues you raised, I think. So,
yeah.
And Hannah, that's a good segue to you, Dorothy's last point about the political movement that seems to have formed, since I know you've thought a lot about that, but more generally, anything about the current moment that we're in that you'd like to raise before we get to the topic at hand?
I think that I just want to echo two comments that were raised by Dorothy. And the first one has to do with the fact that the moment that we're in reflects long-standing unequal structures, right? That I think the tendency is sometimes to feel like, especially given the last 4 years that we've experienced, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of political science. We've just made it through this election. and it appeared rocky at times as to whether we would make it through to a transition of power. And so the tendency, I think, is to sometimes think like, okay, we've somehow made it into the safe zone. And I just want to raise that that is 100% not the case, right? That we're still struggling with and contending with the same systems of inequality and violence that now that we were contending with, you know, within the last 4 years and in the years prior. But I also want to, the second thing that I want to highlight and raise that Dorothy mentioned is just that we are potentially in a moment for transformative change, right? That because all of these inequalities are being brought to the fore, because we're seeing both an explicit expression of and a movement that's gaining steam around trying to address structures of racial inequality. We also have witnessed at the same time really explicit expressions of the desire to hang on to a system of racial authoritarianism. And so, I just want to highlight again that this is potentially a moment for transformative change. And also, given the longstanding nature of systemic racism, of the deep-rooted nature of racial inequality in the United States, like really transformation is what is required, that we should be approaching this moment with, from my view, as radical a vision as we can imagine.
Oh, thank you for that. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about what that vision might look like, at least for the issues of the criminal justice system and incarceration and the law. But one of the things that we've tried to do with these panels for each one is to paint a picture, statistical or otherwise, for the audience as to what is the problem that we're trying to address here. And while they're all interrelated, health is related to the criminal justice system, is related to the political system, is related to economic inequality. The structure of these panels is to try to focus in on one element of that in each of these panels. And today, as you know, it's the issue of the criminal justice system, with a particular focus on incarceration and the application of the law. So let me start with you, Dorothy, if you don't mind. Just give us either statistically, case studies, examples. Let's paint a picture for the audience as to what is the extent of the problem and the way in which the criminal justice system broadly, but issues of incarceration and how the law is applied. How does it treat African Americans differently, and what are the implications of that? If you would just start us off on that.
Sure. Well, I could start with incarceration, which is one of the starkest ways in which the U.S. criminal legal system treats Black Americans in a particularly harsh and unjust way. The United States stands out from all nations on earth for its reliance on putting human beings in cages. In the last 40 years, the US incarcerated population exploded from 500,000 people to more than 2 million people. So we in the United States have the largest incarcerated group of people in the world, and the highest rates of incarceration in the world and ever in US history. Most people sentenced to prison in the United States are from politically marginalized groups: poor people, Black and brown people, Indigenous people, at high rates. And not only are Black people 5 times as likely to be incarcerated as white people, but the lifetime possibility of incarceration is just astronomical. So one study found that Black boys born in 2001 are estimated to be that their risk of lifetime risk of incarceration is estimated to be 32% compared to 6% for white boys. Of course, it's too much for anybody, but the idea that Black boys born in the United States are a third of them are likely to be incarcerated is, should just be shocking to all of us. And the female incarceration rate, of course, is lower, but it's grown twice as quickly as the male incarceration rate, and Black women are twice as likely as white women to be behind bars. I'll just mention quickly police, because police were the focus of the uprisings over the summer, and calls against police violence were triggered by the murder of George Floyd and killings of many, many, many unarmed Black people in America. And police continue to serve to control Black communities through everyday physical intimidation. I think it's important to note the killings of Black people are important to end, but we should also understand the way police function to have a presence in Black communities that hinges on physical intimidation and funneling people into jails, prisons, and detention centers through discriminatory stop and frisk policies and other forms of surveillance and intimidation. And then finally, criminal courts have turned into almost assembly lines of injustice, because thousands and thousands of people living in these targeted communities are routinely arrested for petty offenses or no offenses at all, locked up in jail without trial, and eventually released, many forced to plead guilty just to get out of jail. And then they're saddled with court-imposed fees and monetary sanctions, and often then arrested again and cycled through this kind of assembly line system of injustice over and over again. My point is, it's both a problem of huge numbers of people who are locked up for long periods of time, but also huge numbers of people who are cycled through jails for small sentences, or it's not being sentenced at all. But all of this has a huge impact on Black people's lives. It's disruptive, it causes suffering, it reinforces economic inequality as well, and reinforces also a kind of carceral logic that seeps into lots of other institutions like public schools and healthcare, public housing, public assistance, child welfare, all forms of regulation of Black people and other marginalized people through punitive measures that don't really address the needs of human beings in our society.
Thank you. Thank you for that very clear and systematic picture that you've painted there. Hannah, anything you would like to add or elaborate on this issue of what's the problem? What does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, Dorothy, you've set me up beautifully, because that's where I really wanted to start, was thinking about the fact that the vast majority of people who experience incarceration actually are housed in either state prisons or local jails, and they serve relatively short sentences for nonviolent crimes. So in 2020, for example, 30% of people who experienced incarceration were held in local jails, and the majority of those people were held there prior to trial and conviction. So they were not serving out some kind of sentence. And an additional 25% were serving time in state prison for property, drug, or public order crimes. And these sorts of snapshots, as Dorothy indicated, don't address churn, where people are cycling in and out of jail. Where the Prison Policy Initiative estimated that while there's about 600,000 people who enter prison each year, there are more than 10 million jail admissions yearly. But those are not unique individuals, right? Instead, about 1 in 4 of those people are arrested and admitted multiple times in a given year. And pretrial detention is one area where we've seen extraordinary growth in the prison population since the early 2000s. And Black Americans are disproportionately and vastly overrepresented in that pretrial detention population, where 43% of where they make up 43% of the population that's jailed prior to conviction. And again, as Dorothy noted, this is a consequence largely of a system of policing that functionally criminalizes poverty, where police officers are making arrests for low-level minor behavioral transgressions, things like vagrancy laws, loitering, and petty theft. And only 5% of arrests are actually a consequence of serious violence. And so, I think the larger point that I want to drive home is not one that says that if we sort of deal with low-level non-violent, the problem with criminalizing low-level, excessively punishing low-level non-violent crimes will deal with the mass incarceration crisis. That's not at all what I want to convey, because we aren't going to address mass incarceration without addressing punitive sanctions for violent behavior, but instead just to highlight the extent to which the carceral system is built around order maintenance and around policing, poverty, and issues and behavioral consequences that are behavioral actions that are associated with poverty. And so I think I'll go ahead and just stop there and turn it over to Regina.
Yeah, and I hope we'll get back to some of the issues of the causes and solutions in our next set of questions, but that's great. Thank you for that, Hannah. Regina, what would you like to add to this discussion?
I want to talk about the people who are long timers, because I work with lifers, and in Pennsylvania, they're serving life without the possibility of parole. So the most meaningful statistics to me have to do with racial disparities reflected in the sentences of persons serving the longest terms. A 2017 study conducted by the Urban Institute found that racial disparities in prisons are starkest among those serving the longest terms. In Pennsylvania, for example, Blacks are 11% of the population, 49% of the state prison population, and 60% of those serving the longest prison terms. Nearly 40% of people serving the longest terms were incarcerated before the age of 25. And Black people were, as I said, Black people were 56% of those sentenced before age 25 who were serving the longest terms. People serving the longest terms also tend to be older than the average person in a state prison. In Pennsylvania, the average age is something like 40, but for people serving life terms, it's like 49 or 50. And in the penal context, people who are 55 and over are considered geriatric because of their physical condition, either what they came into the system with or what they developed while they were there. So persons serving the longest terms tend to have a greater risk with regard to their physical health. The difference that might be existing with regard to racial disparities among those serving long terms, I think, has to do with violence in the lives of young minority people and the invisible divide that exists between persons who are labeled perpetrators and victims. The quest to provide relief for people who are not involved in violent behavior, or the people who could somehow would not be considered victims, is one which we have to pierce. People who wind up in prison are likely victims. They were victims who decided that they needed to defend themselves and became perpetrators, or they were victims of violence in other parts of their lives. So this notion that people are somehow perpetrators of violence and not victims of violence is one that we have to see through. One of the reasons that accounts for Black people serving these longer terms has to do with the various wars on drugs that we were engaged in. The war on drugs was accompanied by tough on crime measures, or what's known as law and order. This provided an ideological basis for driving up not only incarceration rates, but for harshening the length and the conditions of confinement. The result was that Black and brown citizens were incarcerated on a mass basis, but we thought we were, or at least the system pretended as if we were convicting people based on notions of individual responsibility, therefore ignoring the context that gave rise to the behaviors that resulted in people being criminalized and punished.
Thank you. It's a great segue into the next question, which you've all necessarily already started to discuss, which is, I mean, it's a horrific set of statistics, and partly I think because of the invisibility of it, many people don't know the extent to which some of the things you've just talked about are going on. But I still find myself, what are the reasons for this? To put it straightforwardly and maybe simplistically, is it the way policies are written? Is it the way policies are implemented? Is it directly and straightforwardly and bluntly racism that certainly allows it to continue? But is it structured as an issue of race? Why are we in the situation that seems like it's getting worse and is so different than many other parts of the world? What are some of the core causes of this? And I know that's a hard question, although you've already begun to address it. But let me start with Hannah. What would you point to as the reason why we have this unbelievable level of disparity?
Yeah, so I think the way that you posed it to us is, and as you just outlined here, is you sort of started by asking, is it about the way that policy is written? Is it about the way that policy is implemented? Is it about structure? Is it about individual straightforward racism? And the answer is yes, 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 all of those things, right? Those things aren't separable. And so when I think about this question, it's very helpful, I think, to take the very long view to try to understand how the modern system of policing and the modern criminal justice apparatus came to be. And so when we take that long historical view, what we find is that these systems were devised with the explicit purpose of managing and reinforcing racial hierarchy, right? And sort of managing newly freed Black Americans in the South and managing new waves of poor Black Americans coming to northern cities, right? And, so if people are wondering, who are listening are wondering sort of where they can go read that story for themselves, a couple of books that I'd like to recommend is Khalil Gibran Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness, which is very good on this point. It makes it very clear how, poor white immigrant populations were treated very, very differently. And the social ills that came along with that immigration was treated very, very differently than the same set of circumstances that were experienced by Black Americans at the same time and in the same cities. And then also Naomi Murakawa's The First Civil Right, which sort of details for us how some of the policies that we very often attribute the rise of mass incarceration to, like mandatory minimum sentencing, for example, how those policies came to be, right? So my view as I try to think about how do we get here is it takes the long view, tries to think about the origins of the modern system of policing, which is rooted in the project of upholding racial hierarchy, of upholding white supremacy, but then also gives way to a suite of tools and a suite of technological tools developed in the 1960s and 70s that make up modern policing practices that are very much about, as Regina mentioned, the war on drugs and the otherwise sort of police order maintenance policing practices that invite sort of a preemptive approach to social problems.
Thank you. Regina, you did mention the war on drugs as one of the precursors or one of the forces that allows this to happen. But what other things, what is it about the way the system is structured that allows for this level of racial disparity in the way the criminal justice system is applied?
Well, I would say, and maybe this comes from my background as a filmmaker, that we have a language that disguises the relationship between what individuals and the predicaments that individuals wind up in and the systemic causes that might have produced such dilemmas for young people, old people, anybody who might be involved in conduct that would be labeled criminal. And it happens at what I call the meso level in terms of group life and group competition. And it also happens at the macro level in terms of institutions and systems, the school system, the healthcare system, et cetera. The law in this country is very much fixated on the notion of individual responsibility, very much fixated on the notion that individuals should get their acts together, and if they don't, they deserve to be punished for the harm that they cause to other people. The ideological construction of the criminal justice system is one which seeks or serves to, I don't know that we can, it pretends not to see what it's doing or not to intend the result of what it has done. But the ideological structure is certainly one which is likely to produce the result that we see, which is the disparate incarceration and criminalization of and deviance, the assignment of deviance. It starts with that to Black and brown males and females.
Thank you. Dorothy, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I would maybe just add by making some comments that I'm struck by in hearing my co-panelists speak, that I think gets to how we've gotten to this point. I was really struck by how Hannah and I emphasized short-term sentences or no conviction and sentencing at all that drives thousands and thousands of Black people into jails and prisons, and Regina's emphasis on long-term sentences that do the same thing. There are stark racial disparities in both types of ways in which the incarceration works. What pushes people into prisons. And so there are also both forms of tough on crime policies that we would have to end in order to eliminate mass incarceration. Also, Regina's point about individual responsibility being an ideological device to disguise the racist structure of criminal injustice. And I think all of this points to the criminal legal system is about blaming and controlling and punishing whole communities of people without real regard to culpability and getting to the cause of harm. Whether it's not understanding that people sentenced to long terms are victims as well as perpetrators, and you can't really distinguish between the two, and also those being pushed in for petty offenses where culpability has nothing to do with it. Many of them aren't even adjudicated, to be culpable of anything. It's just about managing them and oppressing these communities. So if we see how all of this stems from a long history of racial hierarchy, beginning with the enslavement of Black people in America, and we don't have the time to, I know Hannah has put some suggestions for resources we can look at, but you can trace all of this directly back to enslavement and the institutions that were set up after emancipation to basically re-enslave African Americans to the present day, this kind of managing of entire communities. And it shows that the problem is not some kind of systemic malfunction or an aberration. The problem is that prisons work effectively to do what they're supposed to do, And so that should have a real impact on how we think about how to address the problem. In other words, we can't address it just by trying to fix, something that's gone wrong in a system that actually was designed to subordinate whole groups of people.
Well, that's a powerful way to put it, and an eloquent way to put it. And it leads us into the third question, which is, what do we do about this? And I agree that you can't solve one. I was thinking as you were all talking about the causes, that how do you separate that from economic inequality based on race, which is also filters into the ability to address or survive the criminal justice system. But there, we have to start somewhere. And so a question I have for all of you, and I'll start with you, Dorothy, is so what kinds of things have been tried that maybe point to the direction of success, or what has been suggested that maybe hasn't been tried because for a variety of reasons, but we should try? Are there any even small fixes that you could point to that appear like they could begin to help us with this problem?
Well, picking up from what, I guess it's convenient that I'm able to pick up from what I just said. So picking up from that it's, we shouldn't perceive these as aberrational flaws that need to be fixed, but instead think broadly about how to, I would say, abolish this way of addressing human needs and social harms and work toward a radically different way of doing that. Now, it's true that we are not going to tear down prisons and policing and all of that right away. So we need to think about incremental steps we can take to achieve this kind of change. And I have found very useful the concept of non-reformist reforms leading toward abolition. Some of them are ways of just reducing the numbers of prisons, reducing the numbers of police officers and other aspects of this punitive apparatus. Biden has already ordered the end of the federal government's use of private prisons, which is a start in the right direction, but it's not going to affect the vast majority of incarcerated people. So along that line, steps to stop prison expansion by opposing prison construction or shutting down prisons that already exist. Steps to end police stop and frisk practices that have been shown to be racist and to target Black and Brown communities. Eliminating the requirement of money bail to release people charged with crimes. So there's been relatively successful, at least it's made advances, the movement to end the money bail system, and also a whole set of community bail funds where you can donate money to free people from prison who cannot afford, or jail, I should say, who can't afford prison. Repealing harsh mandatory minimums like the ones Regina was talking about, releasing the long timers. I mean, the work that Regina's been doing can be supported. That would be a significant way of chipping away at the prison system. Through amnesty, decriminalizing drug use and possession and other nonviolent conduct, which pulls, again, thousands and thousands of people into the prison system. And then there's the ending the collateral consequences of incarceration. So, people who have been incarcerated continue to be unjustly punished through all sorts of collateral penalties, like restrictions on voting rights, exclusion from public housing and other government benefits, and monetary sanctions. All of that can be repealed and ended. It's unjust to continue to punish people after they've already served their unjust sentences. And then I'll just end with supporting the building blocks that would be needed to build a society without prisons. So legislation that transfers funds currently devoted to carceral systems, like the defund police calls, to community-based efforts to meet people's needs and resolve social conflicts non-violently and without incarcerating people.
Well, that's a great list, and some of those, as I understand it, at least in some places, some of those things, all of them, there are efforts to try to make them a reality, and some of them are actually being tried in different places.
Yeah,
So that's
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, it's real. These are all realistic
Yes,
measures
that's
that
right.
we
Yeah,
can advocate for, and we can realize on the way to the vision
yeah.
of a society that doesn't have prisons at all.
And I will say that I think that, and you know this, all three of you better than I do, that there is a prison abolition movement, and that movement I think is probably, even if it's aspirational, is an important movement to kind of show where the North Star is, even as these smaller changes take place.
Mhm.
Thank you for that. Regina, could you talk a little bit about what you think has or might be tried to make inroads into this very complicated problem?
Well, for the populations of folks that I know the best, lifers serving sentences that leave them ineligible for parole, people who are concerned about them and concerned about the numbers of people who are likely to die in facilities if we don't find ways of dealing with their release, finding acceptable ways for doing it. Those are the folks that I'm concerned about. Mass incarceration resulted in the confinement of people on a mass basis. But when it comes time to reducing that population, we tend to be somewhat stingy. So we want to do it on an individual basis. There are some groups of residents of our penal institutions who are reviewed on a group basis. The decisions of the United States Supreme Court have resulted in resentencing of juveniles sentenced to life. There have also been other situations where groups of residents have been resentenced because they had been convicted under three strikes laws. There is some group reconsideration involving women who suffered the experience of domestic violence, and that got them involved in the criminal justice system. But what we haven't been able to do is to deal with people who are charged with crimes that involve violence, who were part of the war on drugs or the get tough sentencing that was associated with that. And we need to wrap our heads around letting people go, particularly people who have aged in the system, who as young people before the age of 25 were involved in crimes that involved violence. I would say, though, that one of the things that I think is most important and that I came to realize from getting to know folks who were serving life sentences is that we need to involve them in whatever political activity is ongoing outside of the facilities, having to do with their well-being and with their freedom. I'm amazed at how political people inside penal institutions are, how much they want to do in terms of impacting the outside communities. They want to do good. They are engaged in all sorts of activities that have a positive effect outside of the prison. That's worthwhile activity. It's the kind of activity that we see as indicia of rehabilitation, remorse, taking responsibility. We don't want to hand it to people. I don't think they want it handed to them because the very act of engaging in civic activity for your own benefit, for the benefit of your family, for the benefit of your community, is one that allows you to assume agency and to grow. And we need more opportunities for people who didn't have the opportunities when they were young, and who can really make a contribution now that they're older.
That's great and very powerful. I think I read something recently in the Inquirer about the issue of life without parole for felony murder cases.
Mandatory minimum.
Yeah, and I didn't even know what made for a felony murder, but in reading it, I realized that what it did is what it sounded like it did, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is make the punishment, which is already too harsh for other forms of murder, for the types of murder that when I read about the cases, murder is never acceptable, but there were circumstances that made it unbelievable that people were serving life without the possibility of parole. And I think it's at that level that sometimes the problems that we face are so embedded structurally in pieces of the law that people like myself don't even know about that are driving some of this. But before I turn to Hannah, Regina, it might be a little bit of a tangent, but I'm really curious if you could say a few words about the way in which you use documentaries in the work that you do. Part of my own work is more in kind of public opinion research, and I don't know whether they're aimed, the documentaries that you work on are aimed to be used within the legal system or whether they're to change public hearts and minds. But could you talk a little bit about that work?
Both. We have done 2 films that involved lifer populations, one having to do with commutation, one having to do with compassionate release of people who are suffering from terminal illnesses. It's very important to give people the opportunity to speak on their own behalf and on behalf of the groups that they are members of. So in the video on compassionate release, the students were able to interview 2 people shortly before they died, who were talking about their release, the impact that it had on their loved ones, and on the people who were left behind. We were able to film in the hospice of the PADOC system. So we sort of took a camera into places that generally the public does not see. We were able to take photographs of the lifers who were involved in the production of the video on commutation. So we were able to bring a bit of transparency and visibility to a group that ordinarily is not shown or who is shown via fictional stereotypes. They're very different from what you would see in a stereotypical prison fiction account of what goes on in prisons. So we have done that, but we've also done other things like explain why there ought to be affordability and availability requirements imposed on utilities so that poor people can stay warm in the winter and stay cool in the summer and not have their utilities cut off. Because we recognize that there's a relationship between the economic well-being of these communities and the kinds of things that result in behavior that will cause folks to wind up in prisons. And we also know that the prison population that we work with is very concerned about what's going on in communities.
Thank you. Hannah, what would you like to add to this?
Hi. Well, I think, most of the things that I have to say are really reiterate things that have already been put on the table. And so, once again, I think just to highlight, bring out what Dorothy said in terms of thinking about employing an abolitionist framework to try to understand what kinds of reforms are going to help us make progress versus the kinds of reforms that are going to reinforce the carceral machinery, right? And so if I'm thinking about the kinds of reforms that are going to help us make progress, I'm thinking about things like turning away from criminalization, reducing opportunities for police to interact with the public. I'm thinking about divesting from policing and getting police officers out of places like hospitals and schools. I'm thinking about reinvesting in generative solutions that really support the development of human capital and reinvesting in alternative ways of thinking about how to solve social problems that we now ask police to solve. And then I'm also thinking, and this is really rooted in the work in my own research and echoes what Regina has so nicely also put on the table. I'm thinking about politically empowering justice-involved people through ending felon disenfranchisement laws and investing in organizing and mobilizing this group of folks across all kinds of contact, all kinds of experiences, and across all kinds of elections. Because my experience really echoes what Regina has said, which is that this is a group of folks who are really highly politically aware and engaged and interested in contributing. And given the ways in which the criminal justice system interacts with a whole host of policy issues, are really policy constituents. And so to the extent that we can focus on politically empowering this group so that they can have a voice and they can speak for themselves, that is the sort of reform that can push us in the direction of really addressing and undoing the problem of the American carceral state.
Thank you for that. And this is a follow-up, Hannah, for you, but others can jump in if you know, again, as someone who doesn't do work in this area, but is a citizen and pays attention to what's going on, every once in a while I read that this is an issue, maybe not at the level of some of the suggestions you've all made, where Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives seem to agree that there needs to be major reform in this area. Is there an opportunity there? Is that just rhetoric? Do you have a sense of whether this is something that has reached a point where there is a desire to make some kind of serious reform?
I think that some scholars have identified this as a window, particularly prior to the Trump administration, that they viewed that we were, their perspective was that we were approaching a window for bipartisan reform. I think that we need to be quite careful with that kind of coalition building, because part of that bipartisan consensus comes from the idea that prisons are really expensive, that we can cut costs and so that's this fiscal austerity lens, right? And so I think we need to be careful with that, because the reforms that I've offered are not organized around fiscal austerity. They're not organized around cutting costs. They're organized around taking money that we now spend on police stuff and putting that money into other non-police stuff that can actually address some of the underlying issues. But I also think that we should take a step back from that, and we should also try to take a step back from thinking about this at the national level. And instead, we should turn our attention to what's happening at the state and city level, because that's where most of the action around criminal justice policy is happening. That's where most of the action is happening in terms of incarceration as well. And so whether or not there are opportunities for bipartisan reform in those spaces is highly context specific. And so if I'm thinking about the kinds of reforms that we should be pursuing, I'm thinking about sort of this, keeping this abolitionist framework at my center. I'm thinking about sort of holding that vision of what does the world have to look like for us to no longer need prisons. Let's keep that at our center, try to move towards that. But the reforms that we're going to engage may differ from context to context, right? In Seattle, where I did my graduate studies, the organizers on the ground were really invested in defunding the youth jail that was there. That was an opportunity that was present in the city of Seattle that speaks to that overall vision. In the state of Florida, in the last few years, it's been about felon reenfranchisement. And that was something that had bipartisan support, right? So what I want to say to that is—
and public support. And yet it was, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I want to say to that then is, like, focus on your local context. And also, I think it's also important to keep in mind that, like, lots of white people, lots of Republicans also become caught up in the criminal legal system. And that experience has the potential to change their attitudes. And that's a different perspective than, is there room for bipartisan consensus?
Great, thank you, thank you. We have gotten a bunch of really good questions from the audience, so I'm going to try to raise just a couple of them. So pardon my staring at my other screen here, but so one question notes that there's been a fair amount of irony around the pandemic, and that many jurisdictions have moved to reduce the number of youth in detention centers, and other efforts just because of the difficulty of COVID in some of the centers for incarceration. Is there any opportunity to build off of this in any way as we move out of the pandemic era? Does anyone have any thoughts on whether one, as horrific as the pandemic has been, is there anything in the way that states or locales have addressed this issue as it regards to incarceration that could be the starting point for any kind of reform going forward?
Well, and go on, Regina.
I'm not so sure that I think it's going to be a while before we're done with COVID or COVID's done with us. So there is that. There's the material reality of COVID. In Pennsylvania, it's been very, very difficult to get any of the mechanisms by which the state could reduce the state prison population. There's been much more activity in the jails and in the processing of folks who are entering the system than there has been with regard to people who are serving state sentences. The governor thought that he could at least, well, the DOC thought that at least 2,000 people could be released, and I think it came down to 100 or something on reprieves. Compassionate release is not working, and the people who have gotten out of the Board of Pardons are sitting on the governor's desk. The political risks from allowing people who are convicted or have been convicted of crimes that seem to be associated with violence or sexual violence, the political risks are so great, and generally district attorneys have some kind of say, not to mention some victims advocates. And there, I think more political work needs to be done on both ends before we can see any lasting impact of COVID on the populations, other than death.
Yeah. Dorothy, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, I would just echo what Regina said, that the resistance to release incarcerated people who are at high risk and are dying at high rates from COVID shows the kind of work we have to do to really get the public to see the humanity of people who are incarcerated, especially, as Regina was saying, for violent crimes. At the same time, it is a way of bringing this question to the forefront of public debate about the humanity of incarcerated people and the way in which our society is willing to let them die. That is, I think, a powerful way of forcing that question to the public. And it may be that for some more low-level crimes, and I think there has been some attempts to release people who are incarcerated for non-violent crimes, but again, a paltry number. But it's at least bringing these issues before the public in time of crisis. And it's hard to tell, I think, whether there'll be any significant movement as a result.
Thank you. As I said, we've got a number of interesting questions. One's pretty straightforward, going back to what are the way in which race inequities are kind of baked into the system. And one of the questioners asked, what about pretextual traffic stops, and where's that? I mean, it seems like often that's where some of this starts, is this, and it's not just in cars, it's not just traffic stops, it's other ways in which uh, illegal activity or not can be discovered when nothing has happened to lead you to have the right to discover it, to put it bluntly. Where does that, what are your thoughts on that? Has that, are we doing better on that? I do feel like I read a lot about how that's being stopped in different communities. Is that, how big an issue does that remain, and how much is that part of the cycle that you've described earlier?
I think I can start with this one. Yeah, I mean, so pretextual stops are a tool that developed in pursuit of the war on drugs, but they also reflect a broader theory about how to address crime. And it comes from sort of broken windows theory of crime, where if we can intervene in low-level activities before, then we can stop them from escalating to higher level crimes. And so it's a way of policing that because no crime has necessarily been observed. It relies on other types of external indicators. Police officers employ other types of external indicators in order to understand who they think might be potentially engaging in criminal activity. And those external indicators are all deeply raced and classed, right? And that's a theory of crime that is pervasive, that is not just about like stop and frisk in New York City, right? Like police departments across the country on some level are employing this way of policing. And the second problem with preemptive policing is that there's an automatic presumption of guilt, which again is tied up with sort of race and class ideas about where crime happens and who's likely to commit crime. And so this is the sort of suite of tools that I was speaking about, that once the modern apparatus of policing starts to develop, we get to the 60s and 70s, we start to try to think about how to address rising crime rates. Another article that folks might be interested in that really details the legislative record on these policies is called Frontlash by Veshla Weaver, where she's got some really good, evidence that the sort of impetus behind many of these policies were racialized ideas and racialized ideas about poverty, and also the marrying of sort of anti-Black bias with language about criminality. So that sort of suite of tools is born in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that is what characterizes modern day policing. And the last thing I want to say on this point is that it's a suite of tools that can be applied against anybody who's newly determined deviant, right? So it's like when I'm thinking about traffic stops specifically, the thing that the space where we're seeing like that lead to sort of that contribute to the current process of racialization is the role that traffic stops play in immigration enforcement and funneling Latinx people into the carceral system and into immigration proceedings. So it's a suite of tools that contribute to the ongoing constitutive project of racialization.
Sorry, thank you for that. I want to put another question on the table, and this is a topic I know nothing about, as opposed to the other topics we've been talking about, which I know dangerously little about. But so hopefully this question will make sense. But especially courts and extended juvenile jurisdiction probation practices were supposed to be more humane, but in many systems, the application of these practices have caused more incarceration of Black people and people of color as a form of control. How have these practices created the demonization of Black, brown people when they were intended to do, not necessarily intended to do that? So I don't know whether even the premise of the question is right, that these are efforts that have turned out to be problematic, even though they were well intended, or whether they work well in some communities and not others. But are there any of you have a thought on that topic, and whether that's a well-founded concern?
I think that the notion was that juvenile justice was supposed to be justice light, to take into account the fact that young people are in their formative years, and there is some possibility for their being put back on the right path, and juvenile records used to be sealed. And so, yes, that was true. But the ability of prosecutors to treat juveniles like adults has certainly made a difference in terms of the delivery on that promise. And the other thing you have to take into account with regard to Black and brown young people is that they tend to be stereotyped as being older and more mature than their chronological age, and therefore badder when they engage in acts that violate the law. So that means that even if they are treated as juveniles, they may not get the full benefit of being allowed to be in the juvenile system. But the capacity, I mean, the most important thing is that there's choice with regard to whether they will be treated as juveniles or not.
If I could add just a couple comments about both of the last two questions. One,
yes, please.
Just add to Hannah's comments the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court has issued a number of decisions that uphold police discretion, which allows them to make these discriminatory stops with impunity, both rejecting Fourth Amendment arguments that the police should not have been able to make a stop or collect evidence of a crime after they've made the stop. The US Supreme Court has allowed, even when the stop was illegal, for the police to be able to then look up whether there were any outstanding warrants on the person they stopped. And if there are, then to arrest them for that warrant, even though the stop initially was illegal. Also, the immunity that police officers have from civil lawsuits for violating the civil rights of Black and brown people is another way that they are able to continue these practices with impunity. And then as to juvenile justice, in addition to treating Black children as adults, which also means formally treating them as adults, right? Both, as Regina was saying, both interpreting their behavior as adult-like. Even little kids, 5-year-olds have been arrested for having a tantrum, which is interpreted as some kind of violent behavior. And then also charging them as adults, so they aren't even in the juvenile justice system. But many of the systems that are supposed to be more empathetic and kinder than prison end up being really brutal when they target Black people, or including Black children. And so whether we're talking about juvenile justice or diversion, drug diversion programs, and other kinds of programs that are supposed to be alternatives to prison, they can be very controlling and punitive and harsh, and can be a pathway to prison as well.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for elaborating on that. We are unfortunately out of time, and I apologize to the members of the audience who had a number of other good questions. Hopefully, we at least indirectly answered some of them during this conversation. But before I say goodbye and thanking our panel, I want to remind everyone that we will have a second panel on this broad topic of the criminal justice system, this time focusing on policing and public safety. That will be on February 24th, also at 5 o'clock, and we'll be sending out information about that panel as well. All these panels are being recorded, so when they are available for being viewed, we'll let everyone know about that as well. And with that, I would really like to thank our panelists who've given up a lot of their time. And I know this is a busy time for all of you, so I appreciate that. Special thanks to Hannah for coming all the way from Texas, coming on Zoom to join us. It's great to have heard your thoughts. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us. And hopefully you've learned something from our three great panelists. And with that, thank you all. Take care. Have a good night and hope to see you at future panels. Bye-bye.